So good morning, everyone. I am Jen Blandis. I'm an entrepreneurship advisor with UN Women. I think many of you know me already. And this week we are covering legal essentials in the UAE. And who better for us to have go through that is Bianca Gracias, who is the co-founder of Crimson Legal Advisors. And Bianca is very well known within the entrepreneurship community and within the startup community because she does so much to be able to help and support women-owned businesses within the UAE. So we thought who better than to ask to do today's session than Bianca. So before I introduce Bianca and go through all of that, just a little bit of housekeeping. As always, we love it if you take screenshots and share this on social media. We do just ask if you can please tag NAMA Women Advancement and UN Women, and also as well you can tag Bianca, who's running today's session, and you can tag me if you feel like it as well. And we can also be found on Twitter as well. UN Women is also on Twitter if Twitter is your favorite mode of choice for social media, but we find most entrepreneurs, you tend to be found on Instagram and LinkedIn. So here are all of the tags for you to use. So before I hand over to Bianca, just a couple of things. If we could go to the next slide, please. We've spoken about this before, but UN Women has been doing a lot of work liaising with other companies and government organizations in the UAE to help introduce them to women-owned businesses. Because one of the things that we found is that globally, worldwide, women-owned businesses are only getting access to maybe 1 to 2% of procurement opportunities. And given that we make up 50% of the population worldwide, our businesses should be getting more exposure. And so UN Women in the UAE has put together a list of women-owned businesses that they are sharing with a number of companies who have said that they are interested in buying from women-owned businesses. So my colleague Maya is just going to put into the chat box the link where you can register if you haven't already registered your business. Please do click on that link. It will probably take you about 20-30 minutes to go and fill in the details. So please do fill in the information if you would like to be listed on that and listed or contacted when they have events and activities where they introduce you to other buyers or heads of procurement from different organizations as well. Now, before we start, I know many of you have been attending these sessions for a really long time. Just a quick reminder, please, that these are non-promotional sessions. So what that means is that you are to be going into the chat box and trying to pitch and sell your business services, that it is strictly to ask questions and to be able to share your comments on things that are being covered in today's session. So if there are any questions that you have, because we do have around 100 participants today, the easiest thing for you to do is to put your question in the chat box. I'm going to collate everything together and interrupt Bianca throughout her presentation to ask her some of your questions. Now, Maya has put into the chat box the link for the Women-Owned Business Directory, and there is a type form, and you can click on that type form and it will give you all the information to be able to register. And also as well, Maya will share that information again before the end of today's session. So let's kick off legal essentials in the UAE. If we can just go to the next slide. What we would like to know as we do, Bianca, if you can just go back, thank you. Before we do anything, is we love to know from you exactly how much knowledge you have in the area of legal knowledge in the UAE. And the reason why we ask this is that the UN and NAMA Women Advancement like to have a bit of a benchmark to be able to see how your knowledge was at the beginning and how good we were at sharing the knowledge as part of the session. So if I can please ask you, I know sometimes polls are a little bit boring, but if I could please ask you to fill it in, because if we get this data, it gives us the tools to be able to go back to all of the decision makers and say, see, look at the impact that we're making. Please, can we run more of these sessions for women entrepreneurs in the UAE? So if I could ask you to please take a second to fill this in. And while you're doing that, I would love to introduce you to Bianca. And Bianca, if you would like to come on up here, I'm just going to spotlight you so everybody can see you. Give me one quick second. Where's Bianca? There you are. Okay, over to you, Bianca, and then I will interrupt throughout the session as well with questions that we have.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's very nice to see about 100 business owners on here keen to understand legalese. A little bit of background to myself. I've been in the United Arab Emirates for the past 18 odd years, and my core passion is advising startups and SMEs, entrepreneurs, business owners, or even individuals who just have an idea about the next big thing that's going to disrupt the market. Therefore, I'm very active as a mentor with quite a few incubators and accelerators through the region. Right now, my law firm or legal consultancy is known as Crimson Legal, and I'm also co-founder of a business advisory called Suits and Advisors. And because I believe so much in entrepreneurs having good mental health, I've also co-founded Lee Wellness. I look forward to delivering today's session to you in the most practical way possible. Jen, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to end the poll. Thank you to everybody who completed it. Basically, we're looking at, most people don't know very much about the law in the UAE. We have a couple of people who are experts who say that they've got very good knowledge or good knowledge. So I'm sure for some of them, maybe this will be repetition. But the thing that I find here in the UAE is that because it is such a young country, that the laws are changing very quickly as the country tries to update things as quickly as possible. So it's always good to speak with the lawyer to understand what the latest rules and the regulations are, especially if you are a business owner. So Bianca, I'm looking forward to hearing it because I know there's a lot of new information that's going to be really relevant for small businesses today.
Thank you very much, Jen. I'm also looking forward to delivering the session today. So we thought we'd start a bit about knowing the laws that apply to you. A lot of you said your knowledge about the laws in the UAE is poor or average. Well, by the end of this session, we're going to try and enhance it. Now, the idea is not to make you all into mini lawyers. The idea is to bring about education, awareness, so that whenever you think about starting a business, or if you already have a business, where can you go and look for these laws? And the way we've put together this whole session, thanks to UN Women, Nama, and Jen Blandos, is we've put it together in a very practical way. So if you are a non-lawyer, we've put it together in a way that it's easy for you to understand. So feel welcome whenever you wish to pop your questions into the chat box, and we'll pick it up as soon as possible. The idea is to get you as much as clarity as you possibly can in a practical manner. So knowing the laws that apply to you, why is it important for you to understand what laws are applicable to you? Well, the easy answer to that question is because if you don't comply, then you could easily be penalized. That is the easy answer. But we also want to be compliant to make our economy a more sustainable economy, a more ethical economy. And that's what we are aiming for, correct? So knowing the laws that apply to you, a little bit of history to the UAE laws. UAE is a civil law jurisdiction. What do we mean by a civil law jurisdiction? In simple terms, it's unlike South Africa, Australia, India, UK that follow precedents. If a court releases a judgment, then you can rely on that as a precedent. And maybe if you file another case based on that precedent, you can possibly use that. Equivalent to legislation that doesn't exist in this country. You can't also claim punitive damages, for example, or consequential damages. You can prove direct damages in this country. You can claim direct damages. The law here is also intertwined with elements of Sharia law. So while Sharia law is not codified, and you have the conventional laws of the UAE, which are the civil laws that are codified, you will find a lot of principles of Sharia law that are intertwined, which is what makes it such a positive law. For those of you who have spare time and want to read one of the laws someday, you'll see that they're spun in a very positive way. A key thing to remember is each emirate has their own courts. So you have the courts of first instance and the court of appeal in pretty much most of the emirates. We've got 7 emirates, remember that. In addition to these mainland courts, DIFC, which is a free zone in Dubai, and ADGM, which is a free zone in Abu Dhabi, also have their own separate courts. What specializes or keeps DIFC and ADGM apart from the traditional mainland courts is that they also have small claims tribunal where you can bring small claims without the need of having a lawyer. You can directly bring the small claims against them. Of course, there are conditions that apply to bringing these claims. Laws exist at federal and emirate level. Always remember this. Now, what does this mean? When I'm talking about federal, I mean laws exist all throughout the UAE. It applies to the entirety of the UAE. What are some of the examples of federal laws? Immigration, labor, human resources, consumer protection, data protection, constitution. These are some of the laws that exist at a federal level. There is no exception that any emirate can make. I choose to like this law, so I'll follow it. No, there's no exception. All emirates follow it. And then there are laws that apply at emirate level. A very good example, a classic example of emirate level laws are the real estate laws. Believe it or not, for those of you who don't know, each emirate has their own real estate laws and their own regulator for the purposes of regulating real estate in that particular emirate. Now, a common question that I get asked, how can I find laws in the UAE without having to go to a lawyer? Of course, a lawyer would be your oracle of getting all the laws. So how would you find the text of the laws without actually going to a lawyer? Now, remember, these exist at federal and emirate level. So you have to be very careful. Even if you're doing a simple emirate search and you find a law, be careful that you read where this law has been issued and to whom it is applicable. Now, a lot of the government departments in recent years have published notifications of the existence of new laws or publication of new laws in their web pages or social media. So one thing I will say to you as business owners, with all due respect to the national publications, is don't rely 100% on what you see in newspapers. So whatever you see in newspapers may not be 100% accurate. The objective of an article in a newspaper is to make you aware, bring your awareness to something, but it does not, for any means, you can't derive certainty from it. So a law becomes a law only when it is published in something that we call an official gazette. An official gazette is published every month with a summary of every law. It is usually released through the Ministry of Justice in Arabic, and then it is translated and uploaded on portals such as LexisNexis, Westlaw, which lawyers typically have access to. And through there, they get the text of the detailed laws. You can also approach the Ministry of Justice. There is also a website called u.ae, if I'm not mistaken, which is the central website for the UAE government. You pretty much have a lot of information and a lot of laws in the more recent past published on that website. Towards the end of the session, I will be posting one link, which is very critical for everybody to look at. So I would encourage you to go online on this website and have a look at it. Translators, good translators, accurate translators typically also have copies of laws where you pay a minimum fee and you can get a copy of a law, a specific law if you're looking for. And of course, as always, your favorite lawyer. If you have a lawyer on your speed dial, you have a favorite lawyer, you can always get access to the laws that you require. It is very important as business owners to always know the laws that are applicable to you. Why? Because that will help you run your business sustainably, ethically, and in a compliant manner. Now let's talk about some of the legal essentials. When clients come to me, I always ask them, do you have these basics? Now, if you don't have these basics, then I would say little alarm bells should be ringing within yourselves to try and get these documents up and running, or these little action points. These are just action points based on practical examples that we have seen. Now, as you can imagine, legal risks What is the legal risk? A legal risk is the consequence of a loss, right? Legal risks can be prevented or mitigated to a certain extent. And these are some practical points that we've put together to help you with preventing or mitigating legal risks in your business. One, have a business plan. Have a real business plan. Don't have a 2-page plan full of photos or just a vision board. It does not work. Vision boards don't work in the business world. Photographs don't work. You need to have a real business plan with forecasts, budgets, numbers, a competitor analysis, a real business plan. And you also have to have within it a contingency and a legacy plan. We'll come to this a bit later in the presentation. If you have a co-founder or shareholder in the business, it is always critical to have an agreement. Now, gone are those days when we used to rely on trusting somebody. It's great to have trust, but it's also good to fortify the trust through an agreement. So there is never any confusion about what you may have agreed to between yourselves, right? The one thing I do want to point out here, whilst we're talking about agreements, and I'll talk about it a bit later as well, is that the UAE has a very interesting concept, being a civil law jurisdiction, where verbal contracts also are accepted as contracts. So we do need to be careful about what we agree verbally if there are witnesses in place. We'll come to that a bit later. Employee contracts, employee NDAs. Now remember, it is very important to always have a contract, whether you're hiring an intern, a consultant, an employee. Another thing that we also encourage you to have is an employee NDA. Employee NDAs are quite critical, especially, say, for example, if you are going to have databases of clients, which pretty much all 100 business owners of us have, right? We've got about 100 clients on our database. So we need to protect that database and ensure that it is not downloaded, misused. In addition, you may have business policies, procedures, trade secrets that you may want to keep secret. And how you protect this is through an NDA. NDAs are quite critical to a business. And then you also want to have contracts with suppliers, large clients, whoever, all the third parties that you're signing up with. A contract in place never hurt anybody, right? Instead, it helps clarify the terms and conditions. And we'll talk a bit more about what terms you should ideally include with suppliers, employees, etc. All your data must be stored securely, privately, with a cloud backup, ideally. If you're storing it on your hard drive, in, say, for example, Excel format in particular, try and at least save those Excel sheets or Word documents, whatever types of documents you have, in cloud format. Always have a backup to a backup. Register yourself with relevant professional bodies and regulators. For example, lawyers, say, for example, if you're in Dubai, you also need to have an additional licensing or registration with the Rulers Court in Dubai. If you're practicing before the courts, you need to have a registration with the Ministry of Justice. Health professionals in Dubai need to be registered with, say, for example, the DHA. In Abu Dhabi, it's the Ministry of Health. So always find out if there is an additional licensing body or professional body that you probably need to go and get licensed with. And it's always good to have on your speed dial, this is what I always say, a friendly lawyer, an accountant, a tax advisor, a tech whiz, a translator, and a PRO. You should always have these individuals on your speed dial or know somebody who knows them if at all you're running a business in the UAE. And PRO simply means Public Relations Officer. And last but not the least, and forgive me for saying this in advance, you must have 2 business accounts in the very least. Try not to take monies, commercial monies, into your personal account, because that's a big no-no. No matter what kind of license you have, please do not be accepting money for commercial transactions into your personal bank account. And always remember that here banks, and not just here, I correct myself, anywhere in the world, right? Banks can shut down your account with 24 hours notice or less than 24 hours notice for whatever reason, right? So you are best advised to always have 2 bank accounts to save yourself any grief of ever been having the misfortune of receiving that kind of a notice. Now let's talk about contracts. Everybody's favorite topics, everything that keeps people awake, I'd say. Now, we spoke a bit about verbal contracts when we first started out. I told you a bit about verbal contracts, how verbal contracts also are contracts in the UAE. However, you will need to be able to prove that you agree to those particular terms, right? There has to be proof. And proof can be had in the form of electronic conversations. Proof can be had in the form of witnesses, adult, sane, competent witnesses that have had full capacity. Always remember that. Now, that being said, there are risks that come from various parties that you sign up with or bring into your business. So what are the points, if you have a contract with suppliers and investors, what are the main points at least that you need to keep in mind? Hold on a second. Okay. KYC. Now, KYC is simply know your client or know your customer. You simply need to understand and know who you're getting into business with. These days, we also recommend simply doing an internet search to try and understand who you're getting into business with, who's giving you money if they're coming into the business. Who are these people? Can I have their identification? Can I know who you are? Where you're a resident of? Do you have a diplomatic passport? How many passports do you have? Are you going to come into my business through a power of attorney holder, or are you directly going to sign up into my business and come in as an investor? Are the funds that you're going to transfer into my account legitimate? These are all valid questions that you need to ask. And the more questions you ask, the more transparency you have, the better it is. If any facts don't match up, if you do a simple Google search and things like fraud, corruption, bribery come up, you are best advised not to get into business with such an individual or entity. Now, agree clearly the specifications and requirements for products and services. I can't harp this enough, because only you as a business owner know exactly what your requirements are. And it is your role to clearly communicate to your investor or your supplier exactly what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. So always bear this in mind, that it is quite critical to set out very clearly. Now, payments. Now, I assume most of you have set up your businesses to make money, to bring in revenue, right? So try and keep your payments updated. If your payments are outstanding for, say, for example, for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and this is not part of your payment policy, then alarm bells should start ringing. If you're not paying your supplier on time, remember, suppliers get discouraged. Suppliers may not be then incentivized to keep you on the top of their list. So it is always essential to keep your payments updated with your supplier. Now, one key thing that I will tell you, and I have seen this happen very many times, suppliers come back to clients and say, instead of paying me, can you instead pay this particular individual or entity? Do not do that. Do not ever pay an entity that you have not contracted to, because a few things could happen, right? They could be encouraging you to participate in a transaction that may not be 100% legal, legitimate, or compliant. In addition, how are you going to prove that you complied with your contractual obligations to pay the supplier? So if you are signing with a particular entity, always ensure that you make your payments to that particular entity and not to any other third party. Now, if you need an exclusivity, we've had some clients who've said, you know, we are manufacturing this exclusive fabric, and the quality of the fabric, the constitution of this fabric could almost be patented. That's how beautiful it is. And I've said to them, well, if you can't patent it, what is your next best option? And they go, well, I don't know. Well, the next best option for you to do, besides having a non-circumvention clause in your contract, would be to add an exclusivity clause to say when they manufacture this, they will only manufacture it particularly and exclusively for you, and they will only supply it to you. So exclusivity could be a good thing depending on what your business is and who your supplier really is. Identify very clearly how the products are meant to be transported, collected, and delivered. This is very critical. Say, for example, if you're meant to be receiving cosmetics, and cosmetics, as we know, need to be transported in a very particular way. Now, if the supplier or manufacturer is going to be shipping them over to you, please be clear with them how they need to be transported. If any labelings need to be added for the purposes of the UAE, then make sure all these are added. Try and identify all these processes upfront. If services are being provided, please clearly agree deliverables and handover. What are you going to provide them? Are there going to be any variations? And when are you going to hand over this to them? And what constitutes handover? Especially for those of us providing services, it has to be very clear about what we are going to hand over and when we are going to hand over it. And what is that key point, that trigger that constitutes handover? Because if you don't have that very clearly between yourselves, that could lead to confusion, and you do not want a confused supplier. Now, add a clause if you want your supplier or manufacturer to outsource anything. If you don't want them to outsource and you want to control the process of manufacture or supply, clearly add a clause about outsourcing, because this is very critical to your business. You may or may not want your supplier to outsource something. And be wary of dealing with POA holders. We have had instances of fraud where POA holders have come and sign contracts on the pretext of being investors and suppliers, stakeholders in businesses, and then taken money or entered into transactions on behalf of the company, received goods from third parties, and then did a runner. So be very careful when you're dealing with POA holders. Try to always know and understand who the ultimate beneficial owner is or the ultimate stakeholder is who you're dealing with. Agree termination clauses if applicable. Now, I like to look at termination clauses as doors for practical purposes. Just think of a door. You're entering a room. Will you always know how to get out? Of course you will. And that's your door. That's your termination clause. So if you agree the way into a transaction, always know how to get out of the transaction and set out very clearly how you're going to get out of this transaction and what happens immediately after you get out of the transaction. What are the effects of termination, as we call them? Next, coming to contracts with clients. This should be fun. Key considerations with clients. We love clients and we hate clients, right? When you talk about clients, most of us business owners always have mixed feelings towards clients, depending on what kind of client you're dealing with at that point in time. For larger transactions, always know your client. Get as much as information as you want. Now, if you have a retail store, it is not practical to say, give me your passport details, give me your utility bill. Can I know where your mother lives and your father lives? It's impractical, right? They're just buying a garment maybe from you. But say, for example, for us lawyers, we provide transactions to say, we advise on larger transactions. We need to understand exactly who you are, where your source of funds is. We need to make sure that we are advising somebody who actually wants to do legitimate business in this country. So always know your client, particularly where you're dealing with larger transactions, because you do not want to be complicit or help facilitate any client that does not want to do business that's compliant in this country, right? Receive documents with stamps on it. Now, a stamp in the UAE is equivalent to the managing partner or general manager actually signing on it. So it doesn't matter whether a sales officer is signing the document. If at all they have the stamp, it is considered as a valid and binding document on the company. So I encourage you, if you don't know who the general manager of the company is and somebody who's signing the document says, I have the authority to bind this company, I encourage you to get stamps of the document on it, the company stamp. Again, agree clearly the specifications and requirements for the products and scope of work or deliverables of services. Now, only you as a supplier or a business owner know what you can provide your client and what you can't provide the client, right? This is your business. A client's not going to know. They can't pull a feather out of their hat or a dove out of their hat and magically know what you can't do. You're the expert. So have that ethical responsibility in your terms and conditions to tell the client, if you're paying me 10,000 dirhams, this is exactly what you're going to get, and this is how it's going to be handed over. What I don't do is this, A, B, C, D, E. What I can do, if you pay me an extra amount of money, is this. And I assume, these are called assumptions, I assume when I commence work, you're going to have A, B, C, D ready for me. You're going to give me documents in a timely manner. You're going to approve things in a timely manner. You're going to give me access to your data cloud. Whatever your assumptions are, make sure those assumptions are in there. It all boils down to clear communication, right? And you're looking at contracts now, And we're thinking, wow, we thought this was legal. We thought we wouldn't understand it. But now as you see me going through it, I bet you understand and you agree with me that this is quite practical, right? The clearer it is, the better it is for all of us. Again, have a contract. Now, receive payment from your client and not from any third party. If a third party has to pay, you need to get written clarity from both those parties saying why. Because if your bank has to ask you a question, say, for example, why are you receiving these funds from this particular entity or individual? You need to have supporting documents to say, this is why. If you don't, that could be a problem because the banks have the obligation to report any suspicious transactions to the central bank. And what happens then? Then an investigation is launched. And what happens then? Then you're in trouble. And then you need a lawyer for real. Add an exclusivity clause if you require. For example, if you're advising on a very important transaction, providing a service, for example, you want to be the only advisor on that transaction. And if any other advisor comes in, that could be a conflict of interest for you, perhaps, or it could impede your performance. So gauge with common sense, I'd say at that point in time with that particular transaction, whether you want exclusivity or not, or whether you need it. Agree termination and handover clauses, exactly like how I said in the supplier clauses. Termination and handover, absolutely critical. And when you terminate and when you hand over, it is absolutely critical for this to be clear as day. My instructions are terminated. I have completed handover. And what are the triggers for that? If there are no triggers in your contract, make sure you send a nice, polite, happy email to your client, optimistically telling them that your services have now ended and everything has been handed over. Any further instructions for them could possibly warrant a fee, an additional fee. Add exclusions, assumptions, and card rates if applicable. We've just gone through this. Be wary again of dealing with power of attorney holders. And that brings us to employees. You love them or you hate them, depending on how they are. So
before we jump into this, should we cover a few questions? Because there's quite a few questions rather than me throwing them to you at the end. Are you happy with that? Or
yep, let's go for it.
Okay, so there's a question, is exclusivity of a brand supply to UAE a wise thing to do for a business? What should the term of the contract be in that case?
Now, I'm assuming you're talking about distribution. If you're talking about distribution and you're going to be a distributor here in the UAE, typically in distribution contracts, you want to have at least a 5-year term because it's going to take you 3 years probably just to break even and get a proof of concept going, right? And to gauge your market. So you want to typically have, I'd say, a 5-year term. And yes, you want to have exclusivity because if you've got competition, then how are you going to gauge how productive your sales are going to be? All your numbers are based, I'm assuming, on exclusivity, right? So yes, for 5 years, at least you should have exclusivity.
Excellent. Okay. The next one is free zone versus mainland. Which is better for a media business? She's saying BRAC or Masdar or 2454. She's a bit confused about that.
A very, very good question. Whoever's asked this question, and we are spoiled for choice, right, Jen? As you know, we've got about 60 options to choose from, to get licenses from. So really, you're giving me just 3 options. It makes it easier for me to choose from. I wish I could say, oh, Masdar, oh, 2454, but I can't just go, oh, I really need to understand. It depends on your business plan, right? It depends on who your demographic is. Where are you planning to have events, say, for your business? Are you planning to have a big boardroom meetings for your clients? Are you planning to go and market on mainland? If you are planning to go market on mainland and have all these mainland clients as your key demographic, then I would say look at a mainland license. However, if you think that most of your clients are going to come to you, no matter where you're incorporated, and you're getting special benefits from the regulator that's actually licensing you, then choose your licensing regulator on that basis, I would say.
I'm sticking with free zones because we always have lots of free zone questions. Is there a specific UAE law that refers to restrictions of a free zone company to do business in the mainland?
Oh, very good question. Very good question. It really is stated in the decree that sets each free zone up. So everything that is done in the UAE is actually by decree or law. Nothing moves in this country if it is not stated in the law or by decree. So every decree that sets a particular free zone up sets out the parameters of what they can do and what they cannot do. So depending on the free zone that you're looking at, I would encourage you to look at that particular decree.
Okay, they keep coming. I think I've got a few lawyery questions for you. One is, how is the verbal shareholder agreement resolved by UAE law?
Oh, it's a lot of times it's he said, she said, she said, she said. You know, it's very difficult if you can't prove it. So it really boils down to, if you're going to bring a claim before a particular court to the UAE, what can you prove? Because remember, the burden of proof lies on the claimant. You just can't go and bring a claim against somebody if you can't really prove it. So if you're going to be the claimant, fortunately or unfortunately, the burden of proof lies on you. So as much as you can prove.
Okay, and co-founder and partner agreements. What are the do's and don'ts for a startup business?
Co-founders, wow, that is a long answer to a very short question. There are so many things you need to keep in mind. Just quickly off the top of my head, what are your roles and responsibilities? Now, remember, you're going to wear more than 3 hats in a business. If you are a shareholder, you may not just be a silent shareholder. You may also want to be a director. You may also want to be an employee. And sometimes you also want to be the janitor if you have an office, right? So if you have more than 3 hats, remember, you need to clarify this in the shareholder agreement, because a shareholder works on the business. A shareholder does not work in the business. And this is a mistake a lot of people make a lot of times. So in your shareholder agreement, please clarify your roles and responsibilities and exactly what you will do, what you're not going to do, and exit strategy. What if, what if, what if, what if? So agree your exit strategy and your what if scenarios very clearly.
And with the partnership agreement as well, does the lawyer need to witness the partners signing the document?
Very good question. So in the UAE, commercial transactions do not need to be witnessed or signed or registered with the notary public, for example, unless you're talking about documents like powers of attorney. So the notary public only registers or notarizes specific types of documents like memorandum of understanding, powers of attorney, certain types of deeds. They don't always register private commercial transactions. So as long as you're entering into a transaction and the 2 parties are competent, have the capacity, and are capable of signing the document and are doing so out of their own free will and volition, i.e. they are not being forced to enter into a transaction, that particular document is 100% legal and enforceable. Oh, and also the objective of that transaction has to be illegal. You can't agree to do something illegal, right?
No agreements that are illegal. Okay, another free zone. You keep getting asked free zone questions. She wants to know she said, is it true that I cannot do business in Mainland if I take a free zone license?
You cannot actively solicit clients from Mainland. Now, your office has to be within that particular jurisdiction or territory. You cannot actively go solicit clients. You cannot function out of Mainland. You can't say, I'm sitting in Ras Al Khaimah and my office is in Dubai. No, that doesn't work. So you have to, like, strict letter of the law, black and white. Your office has to be there. You represent, you're from there, and you do business from there.
There's so many questions. And they keep coming up. So for a free zone consulting company, in doing business in Mainland, can we maintain a free zone license or do we need a new dual license?
Oh, ask me this question again, Jen.
So for a free zone consulting company, I'm not going to mention the jurisdiction, but just for a free zone consulting company, also doing business in Mainland, can we maintain the free zone license or do we need the new dual license where you're given a free zone and a Mainland license?
Ooh, how are you doing business on Mainland if you have a free zone license?
I was thinking that as well. That's why I'm not naming names. I'm not saying jurisdictions.
Yeah, so if you are doing that, I would encourage you very strongly to get a Mainland license because you do not want to be in that gray area, right? it is a little bit of extra money, i.e. where the office space is mandatory, for example, and you have a few more fees like marketing fees, etc., but it's so well worth it to go get yourself licensed on Mainland if your demographic is on Mainland.
And then someone's asking about having an online business. And this actually I think would be relevant for quite a few people. She's got she wants to know what the legal parameters are that she needs to be aware of as having an online wellness business. So she was saying she offers online coaching regarding to yoga, diet, lifestyle, etc. She plans to do it in and outside of the UAE, but online.
Yeah, you need to be a bit careful with that, right? We need to see your business plan in a lot of detail because we need to ensure that you don't overlap or facilitate in a way any, I assume it's Dubai or Abu Dhabi, right? You should not overlap on any activity that the Ministry of Health or the DHA would consider as medical. That is very critical. So if it's considered as medical activity, then you would need to go get licensed by the Ministry of Health or the DHA. But so your business plan needs to be very carefully vetted. Other than that, I know quite a few free zones and even the Mainland offering activities specific to what you may be looking for.
Yeah. And they're updating them and adding them all the time as well. I think as the economy grows, as people have different business ideas, they're constantly updating what activities you can have as well. Last one, and then I think we're going to move on. If there's been a breach of contract in exclusivity contract, which court of law can be approached?
Oh, this is a loaded question, hey?
And it's a good lead into the next section that you're covering as well.
Yeah. So it's a very good question. Now, assuming you have a contract, right? And they said they have a contract, right, Jen? A breach of contract.
Yes, a breach of contract.
Okay. Now, it would largely need us to refer to the potentially one of the last few clauses in your contract that typically says governing law and jurisdiction, right? That clause will set out what you have agreed, where the dispute would go to. Now, you could have agreed Mainland courts, you could have agreed arbitration, or you could have agreed one of the small claims tribunals in ADGM or DIFC. So it really depends on what you have agreed. Now, let's assume it's silent, or it just says something like UAE courts, something very vague. Then by default, it would go to the courts where the actual transaction occurred or where the parties are based primarily. So either of the courts could claim jurisdiction in that case. So try as far as possible to agree in advance where you're going to go to dispute, if at all you have a contract in place, is what I'd say. And Jen, with your permission, I'm going to move on to the next section.
That would be great if you could do that, and then I'll gather up the next questions. So if you have questions, just please pop them in the chat box, and then we'll have another little intersection, and I'll ask Bianca a few more questions. Thanks, Bianca.
I love that everybody has questions because it shows that you're engaged. It also shows me that you're understanding what I'm saying and I'm not just speaking gibberish. I'm trying my very best here not to speak legalese, so keep the questions coming. Now, key considerations when you hire employees, right? Now, keep this in mind pretty much when you hire consultants for you, independent consultants, freelancers, interns. Try to make sure you always have a contract in place. Now, where you have employees, of course, you have to go that extra mile and make sure they have proper labor contracts in place, right? Registered with the Ministry of Human Resources where applicable. Now, ensure their job description is very clear. This is only fair to you and fair to the employees that you hire. Have company policies and processes in place and don't treat it like this secret document where you hide it in your safe and it is there, it exists, but nobody knows what it says and you can whip it out anytime and surprise the employee. No, these surprises don't go down very well with employees. I would encourage you very strongly, based on my limited experience, that you have company policies and processes in place, write them down, explain it to your employees, give them a proper induction of what can be done in your company, what cannot be done. what powers they have and what powers you have. So if at all there is any breach, a client issue occurs, they are well equipped. They know what the policies are. And policies could be something as simple as ESG policies, for example, anti-bribery policies, no accepting gifts, etc., no taking monies from clients, no doing any favors for clients, something as simple as this. Or your IT policy, for example, do not download any client information, do not correspond with clients outside office hours or from your personal email, things like this that go into your policy. Just like I said, have an employment contract in place, explain the induction and exit process. So when an exit process is set out clearly in your policies and procedures, it helps make everything pretty clear, right? So you're not surprising the employee at the end of the day. If you can sign non-disclosure agreements, please do so and include IP waivers. What does IP waiver mean? If an employee joins your business and say, for example, they're working on a proposal to a client, then this particular employee leaves the business and goes, and they've not signed an IP waiver. Whatever work they have produced in their time with you is their property. I'm sure pretty most of you must have gawked at this, but it is true, believe it or not. So you need to have a clause either in your employment contracts or your non-disclosure agreements to clearly say, A, everything that you do in my company is confidential, strictly confidential. And B, whatever you produce whilst you're working with me is my property. It's the company's property. And when you leave, or even when you're employed, you can't copy, download, and transfer my information to any third party. Why? Because it's mine. Provide a good work-life balance to your employees, because remember, at the end of the day, a happy employee equals a happy client. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to give your employees a good work-life balance. Try not to turn them into mini slaves, if you know what I mean. Do not permit documents to be downloaded and copied freely, just what I mentioned earlier. And we're going to talk about this in data protection a little later. And train your employees on confidentiality and keep reiterating. I say it to them 100 times in a year if you must, but keep emphasizing how documents must be kept confidential. What are the fines for breaching confidentiality? How secret this particular document is, your processes, your procedures, client information. Keep harping, send circulars if you have to, but emphasize what is confidential. So at no point in their employment history, they should be unaware of how secret or confidential something particularly was. And upskill and provide training as and when the business can afford. Nobody wants stagnant employees in your business, right? You don't want an employee that's been there with you for 10 years and has not really gone for any training, not upskilled, just been that one person who really seems happy and has been doing the same thing for 10 years. Well, there's something called evolution, which everybody must keep up with. And with the changing times, upskilling and training always comes in handy. Right? You want to upskill if you have an employee that's, say, loyal, you want to upskill that employee, keep them engaged, keep their mind going, right? And so they can contribute more and better towards your business. Now, legal risks to consider in partnerships. This comes back to one of the earlier topics somebody had asked me about. Now, what type of partner are you? Are you a shareholder, joint venture partner, collaborator, broker, agent, lender, investor? It is very critical to understand what type of partner you are before you actually decide what kind of contract you are going to sign. It is very critical. If you are an investor, don't sign a collaboration agreement. If you are just lending me money for some time, I should not be signing a shareholder agreement with you, because you're just giving me money for the time being. So you either sign an investment agreement or a lender agreement. So have your roles and responsibilities carefully chalked out. Be mindful of sharing licenses. I get a lot of questions saying, can I share licenses? The costs are too much. Well, yeah, it's not cheap anywhere in the world. You need to invest in your business. And if you don't have skin in the game, how are you going to, scale the business, start the business? Don't try and share licenses unless and until you actually want to be shareholders, because the risks are phenomenal. You don't know, maybe you don't know this person. They just seemed nice in 2017. And then in 2020, you still don't have a shareholder agreement and you're still sharing a license and you have no clue what the other party did. Maybe they got fined. and the business expects you to bear the fine as well. You never know. Several things could go wrong when you're just sharing licenses. It's not the legal thing to do. So I highly discourage it. Even if you have a lawyer draw up agreement, I don't do these types of agreements. I don't really recommend it either. Clarify roles and responsibilities without going into too much detail. I've already spoken about it. Clearly say what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, how you're going to get out, and address all the what if scenarios. What if you decide you don't want to stay in the UAE anymore? You want to go work from, I don't know, Finland. What if, right? What if you disappear off the face of the earth and I can't find you? I can't track you down for 3 months or more. Address all these scenarios in your contracts. Address also something called continuing contributions. Very many times clients come to me, and I know this is going to be a pain point for a lot of you listening. They come to me and they say, my shareholder, when we started our business in 2018, was so nice and friendly. We used to have coffee every day in the morning till one day we stopped having coffee. And now my shareholder comes in sometimes into the store and sometimes doesn't come into the store. Well, where is your contract and what did you agree about continuing contributions? What are your continuing contributions as shareholders? What will you continue to do? This is something that is very critical for you to look at. And if you have shareholder agreements in place, I would also encourage you, if you want to be compliant, go a step further and try and review those contracts at least 3, 4, 5 years. Be mindful of personal liability if you are a general manager or director. Now, you cannot exclude liability. If you are a general manager or director, you are personally liable under the UAE Companies Law. Remember, ADGM and DIFC have separate laws. But that being said, if you are a general manager or director, be careful of what documents you sign and the businesses you enter into, the businesses you transact with, because you still have personal liability that you cannot escape from. Confirm the ownership of assets and who is in control in advance. Typically, when you get into partnership with somebody, the company needs to control or own the assets, right? It shouldn't be one particular individual. So try and have an inventory or a list of the tangible and intangible assets and clearly state who controls these assets, right? And make sure they're all owned in the name of the company. If an individual or a shareholder owns it, that needs to be transferred. A shareholder cannot hold the assets that belong to a company. Be mindful of sharing information, office space, employees, cloud storage, and technology. Now, it's great if you're sharing stuff, right? Sharing is caring is the age-old adage, but not in legalese, right? As far as lawyers are concerned, we're quite resistant when it comes to sharing. You tell us about sharing, we kind of like cringe our faces, because what are the terms of those sharing, right? How are you sharing? What are the terms? This has to be clearly set out. If you don't have this set out, it's not legal for you to share. Please try not to share. Try and get your own technology, employees, office space, if you possibly can. Disputes in partnerships, again, always go down to contracts. What have you agreed? If you are shareholders on a license, for example, and you don't have a dispute resolution clause, the default will be the courts, where the company is incorporated or where the transactions occur, depending on the majority of transactions. But if it's a shareholder dispute, typically it will go to the courts where the company is incorporated. Now, risks that are in a business are always covered in 2 ways, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, risks are the consequences of loss or damage arising to your business. And there are 2 ways that we foresee how risks can be mitigated or prevented to a certain extent. One is through contracts, and the other, believe it or not, is through insurance. So if you can get insurance in place, try and get insurance in place. Professional indemnity insurance for businesses like mine, like lawyer businesses, accounting, auditors, I typically have professional indemnity insurance. Property or risk insurance, where you have physical property, say a store, for example. Third-party liability insurance, where you have clients coming into your store, say, for example, or you are taking machinery, say, for example, and you're gardening, just by way of example. Life insurance, it's always good to have. Business protection insurance. Now, business protection insurance is akin to life insurance. However, it is typically provided to shareholders in a business, individual shareholders. And goodness forbid, one of the shareholders unfortunately passes away. There is a kind of a life insurance that is paid out to the heirs or successors of that particular deceased shareholder. So you, as a living business owner, don't necessarily need to pay out an actual proportion to the share to those heirs, and you get all the business back to you. Not automatically, but you hold the right to get that particular deceased shareholder's shares back to you by just making this payout. Your business may or may not have money to pay out if you don't have a business protection insurance and somebody passes away. So business protection insurance is a great thing to look into if you have 2 or more shareholders that are individuals in a business. Acronyms that you should be familiar with now. A lot of lawyers, accountants love acronyms. And I thought I'd put together a few acronyms that you typically come across. So as and when these are thrown at you, you can just look at it and go, oh, what does AML mean? Yeah, okay, it means anti-money laundering. CDD, customer due diligence. So these are the most popular acronyms that you see thrown around. If you ever need this as a checklist, take a screenshot, have a copy of this presentation later, and you can always review this at your own discretion. Websites and applications. So now we are obviously in the Gen Z tech era, and a lot of us have businesses that are technological based. We have tech. So what are the most important things that you need to consider if you are a business where you use websites and applications, and say you transact through your website and application? What are the things to consider? Now, remember, this is not a comprehensive, all-inclusive list. This is subject to the features that you have on your platform. So please remember that this list is put together based on what you may have on your platform. Things that you must have on your platform, even if it's a showcase website, terms and conditions. Now think of your website or your application as your little kingdom, right? This is your little kingdom. What can people do in your kingdom? How can they enter? Can they browse? Can they not do? Can they copy? Do they need to be a particular age to enter? So terms and conditions are a great way of telling your demographic or your viewers or users what they can do, what they can't do in your kingdom, and what your kingdom offers them. Privacy policy. If you're receiving even feedback forms through your website, if you're receiving any kind of information through your website, you must have a privacy policy. What does a privacy policy state? It simply states, if I'm receiving personal data from you, this is how I'm going to store it. This is how I'm going to collect it. This is what I'm going to do with it. And these are the entities I'm going to share it with. And if at all, at any given point in time, you want to cancel the personal data that I'm holding about you, you can approach me and ask me to remove it from my database. You have to provide a clear privacy policy. It cannot be wishy-washy. It has to be as clear as day. And a disclaimer. A disclaimer simply states, I'm not responsible if you click a link on my website and go to, say, Google, or you go to Facebook. If there is a third-party link, that I release myself from all liability. You have to read the terms and conditions of that particular website, for example. Now, coming down to specifics. Now, here's where it really depends on what features you have on your website. What additional things do you need to consider? If you're having bookings on your website, some people can book by, think about having a booking policy, cancellation policy, refund policy, very clearly set out. A cookies policy. If you have cookies, if you're using cookies, you will want to consider a cookies policy. If you're using Google Analytics, for example, there has to be a special clause regarding the non-personal data that you are tracking through Google Analytics. Additional, if you have products, right? You're dealing with products on your website, think about shipping, delivery, refunds policies. And if your website or application has something like a community that you're offering, think about the community guidelines that you have to place in there and a comment policy. Remember, the UAE has very strict rules surrounding defamation, content. So be careful, because you as a website owner are responsible for what you allow to showcase on your website. So if you are allowing comments from third parties to be placed onto your community or your website or platform, somebody needs to be there to monitor those comments to make sure that they are PG rated. And have a security policy in place for those of you who are involved in, say, websites or platforms that have a certain level of security as an element to it. Try and include a very strong security policy that gives reassurance and has a process in place for security breaches, etc. Security policy is quite important if you are in that domain. So I hope this gives you a bit of a flavor of what you need to do if you are a technology-based business. And always remember, it's subject to the features of the platform. This is not an all-inclusive list. These are some of the main things you need to consider that we've put together. Now, Jen, shall I continue to data protection and consumer protection, or do you want to field a few questions?
There's quite a few questions. Maybe we just break this up because there's a lot of people going back as well to talking about intellectual property and who owes what, and MOUs and things like that. Actually, let's start with this one. Can you give us info on a memorandum of understanding? Instead of doing a partnership agreement, I would like to do an MOU with a colleague. Do you advise it?
Instead of doing what did they say? Instead of doing a contract?
A partnership agreement.
Right. A memorandum of understanding can be binding or it can not be binding. So it really depends how you position it, right? It is still a contract if you state in the MOU that this is a valid and binding contract. So whilst you can call it MOU, be clear to include in there whether it's binding or not. And if it's not binding, then at what point does it become binding? And if it is binding, then clearly also mention that this is a contract between the two parties, and then proceed to set up the clear terms and conditions between the two of you. A partnership contract is recommended because then it gives you more room to add additional detail.
Excellent. And today we hire freelancers from platforms such as Fiverr for activities such as marketing and content creation. Which legal parameters do we need to consider when hiring freelancers online for remote or online work? How do we protect ourselves as a startup in terms of intellectual property?
First and foremost, you always need to have a contract with these parties that you hire, right? The IP waiver clause should always be in there. Confidentiality should always be in there. And secondly, if you're hiring from Upwork, Fiverr, etc., read the terms and conditions, because Fiverr and Upwork do have a complaints and dispute resolution policy where they try to mediate between the two parties. So try and read those terms and conditions properly and write or rewrite your contract to mirror those terms if you can.
Thank you. And can a company in a free zone hire a team member remotely based in another country?
Absolutely. You would probably need to sign what we call a consultant agreement, not really an employee agreement if they're not based here as an employee.
Super. And let's talk about liability really quickly. If you run an LLC business, are you still personally liable being a founder director?
Yes. That was easy. Yes, you are.
You're liable, but the LLC means limited liability. Do you want to explain? Yeah. Because I think this is where entrepreneurs are sometimes getting stuck, that they speak with some PROs and the PROs will say to them, oh, no, go for this kind of license. It's like 5,000 dirhams cheaper. It's not going to matter. The liability doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Go with this kind of license. Do you want to just explain the difference between limited and unlimited liability?
Yeah, so the most common types of corporate structures in this particular country are sole proprietorships, professional licenses, if we call them, and trading licenses, typically that are limited liability company setups, right? So when I talk about sole proprietorship, you are responsible individually as a business owner, and your liability is unlimited because it's direct personal liability. Licenses that have direct personal liability are good example is the e-trader license, right? You have direct personal liability with an e-trader license. Now, when we're talking about limited liability companies, you as a shareholder, your liability for anything that goes wrong as a civil claim, a third party brings a claim against you, you want to dissolve the business, khalas, close it, your liability as a shareholder is limited to the value of your share capital, your issued share capital. So always remember that if your share capital is 300,000 and you own 50% of the business, then your liability is 150,000. Now, this is different from your liability as a general manager or a director. As a general manager and a director, you are personally responsible, regardless of whether you have an LLC or a sole proprietorship, for any actions that that business undertakes that may not be in compliance with the law. So always remember this, you can't avoid personal liability if you are the general manager. So be very careful with the transactions that the business undertakes whilst you are director or general manager.
Thank you. And I just want to confirm, because while you were speaking about that, somebody wanted to just clarify personal liability. Does that mean personal assets? I'll let you answer that.
Yes, that's
it
easy.
Means
yes.
it means they can take your house or your car. I know some businesses where they initially set up as a sole proprietor because they were told that it was cheaper. And, in the beginning, oftentimes what happens is you don't know because you've never had a business. So you think, okay, this PRO is giving me the right advice, and so I'm going to set that up. And as your business grows, being held liable, having unlimited liability for your business can be very risky. And I know a number of entrepreneurs have actually changed the structure of their businesses to be an LLC, so they do have that limited liability. So it is something to keep in mind that, it might be a little bit cheaper, but it might not be the best way forward for your business. And also as well, we were speaking about e-trader, Bianca. Someone has put in a conversation about e-trader, and they want to know if there's a threshold of revenue to hold an e-trader license. And I know you and I both maybe have views on this. Do you want to give your thoughts on that?
A threshold on revenue. Look, this is a very generic comment, right? Are you talking about threshold of revenue for purposes of VAT? Are you talking about it for purposes of economic substance? Like, what does this relate to?
Maybe if the poster who wrote that can clarify, but I suspect probably what she's asking, because I hear this as well from other entrepreneurs, is at what point do you need to take that e-trader license and register it as a fully fledged licensed business, as an LLC or a sole proprietor? I think that's probably, yeah. So she said, when the revenues grow, should I switch? So I'll let you give your view. I can give my view from what I hear as well.
Well, as a lawyer, I'm a little risk averse. So I would say, if you can start with an LLC, start with an LLC. Now, where you can't, you have to start with, say, for example, you take an informed decision, start with an e-trader, at least for the first year. As soon as you can switch, and remember that even with the e-trader license, you can't just say, oh, it's expired and let it go. You have to close the e-trader license down, right? And they cost money to close it down. So always close down that license, and at whatever point you feel comfortable, your business plan allows you to actually scale and grow, get an LLC incorporated. Try to steer away from companies that bring on personal liability onto you, and move towards LLCs if you can.
And, I always say to entrepreneurs that the e-trader, or the equivalent that they have in Abu Dhabi as well, is great if you want to test a business idea. And it's something for you to be able to see if that business idea works. But then when you see that your business idea works and you have a business, switching to an LLC is going to be a much safer option for you. And I'm very conservative and risk adverse as well. And you don't want to have a business on your hands which is going to have unlimited liability for you. So it's good to test that business idea and then register your business as an LLC. One other comment, someone said, I thought an LLC protects the shareholders of personal assets. A civil company takes your personal assets if someone sues your company.
Yes, this is correct. This is correct. However, if you are the general manager and a claim is brought against you in your capacity as general manager, you cannot avoid that claim.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Let's do some of the other stuff. here, and then we'll come back. There's lots more questions as well.
Okay.
Actually, one other thing, Bianca, I want to ask you, because this is important, because I see this a lot. Things like terms and conditions for websites. A number of entrepreneurs either don't do it, or they go and buy some off of the internet for $20 or copy somebody's terms and conditions. Can you explain to me why that's maybe not a very good idea, and why they should maybe invest in getting terms and conditions written for the business?
Yeah, so if at all, for example, you're an e-commerce platform and a dispute is brought to you now, bear in mind that, and we're going to talk about consumer protection in a bit, but consumers are smart these days, right? They know what their rights are. Now, whilst they can bring a claim against you through consumer protection, did you know they can also bring a claim against you through Stripe or Payfort or whatever your payment gateway is? So they can actually bring claims against you. And how do you protect yourself from any claims that are brought against you? Through your terms and conditions. Now, it is very important for you to understand what your legal risks are based on what your website includes or doesn't include. So if your website has a particular feature or function, a standard generated terms and conditions will not know really what your website is and what features it includes. So even if you do generate these standard terms and conditions, so you get them from a friend of a friend, try and review them with a lawyer to make sure it actually is applicable to you. I've seen plenty of terms and conditions from websites, and I'm one of those, right, who goes to terms and conditions and privacy policy. I would love to review your terms and conditions. Sometimes I spot these errors. I see names of companies that should not be there. And then I know those are not your terms and conditions. You probably copied them from somewhere. And that's an absolute no-no, because then that's, again, plagiarism. So as far as possible, try and keep your terms and conditions relevant to your business to avoid any risk.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Bianca. Okay, let's move on.
So let's move on. These two sections that I'm about to cover are possibly the most important in terms of you being a business owner. And I kid you not when I say they are the most important. So if you have questions, please ask them now within the limited time that we have. Try and also read these laws. These laws are readily available on the internet if you do a simple internet search on the UAE government portal, websites, etc. The first law that we're going to talk about is data protection. This is a federal law. Now, remember, we spoke about federal laws applicable to everybody in the UAE. The first of its kind, effective 2nd of January 2022. And it's also said or refer that we will be expecting executive regulations or implementing regulations, which will also set out what further penalties will be levied if there are any breaches of this particular law. Another thing that I do want to point out is, as long as data is being processed within the UAE, or even if UAE data, UAE relevant data is being processed by an individual or entity outside the UAE, this law has extraterritorial jurisdiction. So bear that in mind. This is the first of its kind, a law that has been published, a federal law. It is quite comprehensive. This law is titled 45 of 2021, and there was a previous law released called 44 of 2021 that also facilitates the setup of a UAE data office that will be the governing or regulatory body that will monitor effectiveness, compliance, and regulation that deals with this particular law. And you can see I've set down a summary here of what this data protection law entails. It's pretty easy, comprehensive, easy to read and understand. So I'll go to my next slide, data protection. Now, the key features of this law that you should keep in mind. This is the first federal law, as I mentioned to you, on data protection. It covers personal data, and it also includes personal data like individuals' name, their voice, image identification. So if your business is receiving any type of personal data from clients, you cannot avoid this law. And of course, all of us receive personal data of clients, right? So you have an obligation to store this in a correct manner, in a secure manner, have a data controller, have data processes in place, talk about security, privacy, all these particular policies within your company. Remember, this does not apply to government data, which is always kept confidential, security, regulatory, judicial authorities, banking personal data. And remember, DIFC and ADGM have their own data protection laws, so they are outside the purview of these laws, including health regulators, say, for example, like the Ministry of Health, the Dubai Regulatory Authority, Health Authority, sorry. Data subjects' rights. Now, when I talk about data subjects' rights, I'm talking about the personal data of the individuals or clients that are giving you this data. Say, for example, you have a website and you have even something as simple as a feedback form, or somebody is buying something from your website and you get this data, right? What rights do they have? They have the right to obtain information from the controller. They have the right to come to you and say, what information are you holding about me? Can I see that information? Can you transfer this information here to me? Can I erase my information? I do not want you to have my information anymore. And it is your obligation to delete that information. Can I restrict you from processing this information? I do not want you to process this information. I want you to stop using my information. And I want you to stop automatically sending me, say, any mailers through MailChimp or any other software. So these are all the main rights that data subjects have in this country. Before I come to consumer protection, I want to give you just a simple example, just to put how important data protection is into perspective for you and what you can do and can't do. Say, for example, you have a restaurant, you own a restaurant, and a client comes to your restaurant, enjoys a meal, raves about the hospitality, loves the hospitality in your restaurant. And you provide them with a feedback form. And in that feedback form, you say, now that you enjoyed having a meal with us, thank you so much for your feedback on this form. If you can leave your email address, we'll notify you about all the discounts that we have in the future at our restaurant, so you can come visit us again. Now, if you have collected information on that basis from that particular client, please remember, you cannot then add them to a marketing list that talks about your business, that essentially is marketing material. You can only send them discounts if they have provided their consent for discounts. The key to remember in anything relating to data protection is consent. Have you received consent from that client to send this? You cannot, moving forward, you cannot just assume somebody wants to be added to your marketing list. So my friends, if you have a list, a database, you have to go through each and every of those clients to make sure they have consented and you have recorded consent for them to receive your mailers. There is no exception to this rule, and you will be penalized if you breach this law. So be very mindful of this. Now I'm sure you're all happy to know this information. Now, coming to the consumer protection law. Now, we did have a consumer protection law back in 2006, a federal law again. We've got a new consumer protection law that became effective in 2021. It was released in November 2020, it became effective in 2021. Now, the key thing with this consumer protection law is that it is effective on a federal level. It seeks to fortify the consumer protection in place. Now, why is it important for you? For all 100 of you, it is important because whether you provide a service or you provide a product, you are all governed by this law. You cannot escape the consumer protection law. Your clients and your consumers have rights under this law to go and file a complaint against you. And why should you be concerned that you need to comply with this law? And better yet, I would encourage every single one of you to read this law completely. And I'll give you a link later. I'll tell you why in a minute. Now, remember, this law applies to all goods and services in the UAE, including free zones and including e-commerce. You cannot escape from this law. Again, it intertwines with the data protection law, and it protects consumers' personal data. So if you are receiving personal data, again, you cannot circulate this data, not even to your sister companies. You cannot divulge that data to a third party unless you have received consent. This law also sets out specific information relating to provider and commodities. So it is very important to just read that particular section in the law as and when you get time. If you're selling commodities, your product description and specification needs to be absolutely clear and true and accurate whenever you're selling it to third parties. Here's the other thing, right? all your invoices, as mentioned in the law, must be in Arabic. If you issue an invoice, it must be in Arabic. I know what you're going to say to me. If you can issue an invoice in another language, English or whichever other language you want to. However, as a primary essential, all invoices must be in Arabic. The law does not state if the invoices are not in Arabic, what happens, but it just sets out this positive obligation on all of us suppliers. Now, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, if there are any gentlemen here, you need to be worried about this particular law. Besides it being applicable to you, if found in non-compliance, and this is something that wasn't there in the law that was in 2006, this is recently introduced now since 2021. Suppliers, i.e. us as business owners, we can be susceptible if we are found guilty or we are found that we've breached one of the rules and regulations under the consumer protection law. We can be penalized for a jail term up to 2 years and fines ranging from 10,000 dirhams to 2 million dirhams. So please bear this in mind. I cannot emphasize how important the consumer protection law is. The consumer protection is regulated, by the way. Each consumer in every emirate can go to the relevant consumer protection department, typically regulated by the Ministry of Economy in that particular emirate. Each of the 7 emirates have very active consumer protection departments. I will be sharing a link with you because it is essential for you to all have an understanding of this law. There is no getting around it. I would highly encourage you to get on the website link that I provide you and read this law so you understand that it is very important to have a complaints policy in place and try and pretty much ensure you have happy clients at the end of the day, or your terms and conditions are very clear and that you have performed your services or sold your products in accordance with the law. And I think, Jen, that brings us to the end of the session.
Yeah, can we go back before we go to the poll quickly? Because a couple of questions. So one, I know this gets asked a lot of times and it gets asked of me as well. If we go back and talk about data protection. If you, let's say, for example, you do an event with a partner or a sponsor, and then they go and say to you, great, really great taking part in this event. Can you please give us the list of everybody who came to the event? Now, we as a business refuse to do that because our customers or our members haven't given permission. Some companies do. Do you want to just give your view on that and maybe your advice to other business owners that might get asked to do the same?
Yeah, with the launch of the consumer protection law, and now especially with the data protection law, you must have consent on board. If me as a consumer, say Jen shares my information with an events company, and that events company contacts me, I have the right to go to the UAE data office or the consumer protection forum, depending on which law has been violated, and file a complaint. And if it can be proven or it cannot be proven that Jen has consent from me, that could be a problem for Jen. So it is very important for the entity sharing information with Jen to also share the consent specifically that I've provided to allow my personal data to be shared with Jen.
Yeah, so if you do get asked to do that, you need to ask your people on your list if you're allowed to share it with them first. Okay, lots of questions about the Arabic invoice issue.
I knew it.
You just had to chuck that in at the end, didn't you? Because I think everyone's saying, what? I don't issue my invoices in Arabic. What about, the consumer and us who don't read or write Arabic? Someone's put, this is strange. So I think everybody now is going to go back and look at their invoicing. Okay, I want to talk about e-traders. I hear this as well. Oftentimes, there's misconception that people think that depending upon what kind of license you have, it exempts you from certain rules and laws in the UAE, which in fact it doesn't. For example, I have people say to me, oh, I have an e-trader. That means that I don't need to charge VAT. So, all of these things, do you want to just explain, do you want to just go into a bit more detail about that as well?
Yeah, definitely. So there are certain rules and regulations, especially the federal ones, that you can't get away from. There is no escaping. Do not go to your friendly lawyer and say, hey, I want to do this. Can you, but I don't want to, get an expensive license. Can you help me get around it? No, we don't provide that kind of advice, and you cannot get around the law. Some things that are mandatory are, for example, the consumer protection law, federal, can't get around it. Data protection, federal, can't get around it. And remember, if you are in DIFC or ADGM, then you have additional laws similar to the federal laws that still apply to you. So you can't get around the laws. If you are in the UAE, regardless of whether you're on free zone or mainland, and you fall in specific activities, there are about, I think, 7 or 9 activities, you may have to register on the Ministry of Finance website for something called economic substance regulation. So if you fall within those particular categories, you can't escape it. And if you change, by the way, if you change your ultimate beneficial owners, within 15 days, you are obligated to notify the Ministry of Finance. Similarly, if you change your, for VAT purposes, if you meet the threshold, you're registered. If you change your ultimate beneficial owners, you sell your business or you buy a new business, you must inform the ministry that this information has changed. Also, let's talk about UBOs for a brief few seconds. Your ultimate beneficial owners, who ultimately owns your business, the ultimate beneficial owners, the individuals' names need to be registered with the person, with the entity where you are licensed. There is no going around it. So as far as a lot of these federal laws are concerned, there are no loopholes and there are no exceptions. If they apply to you, you best follow it.
Yeah, don't look for loopholes or ways to get out of it. It's best to follow the law and do it properly, because the fines for not doing that are pretty great. And also as well, a number of our members have been fined for not completing ESRs or UBOs on time. And that's really important as well, that you need to check with your licensing authority to make sure that all of those are up to date. So for example, I was in the portal of my licensing authority on the weekend, and I noticed that there was a whole section on compliance, and I went in and checked, and it had the ESR and the UBO and all of these things, and it said up to date, up to date, up to date. And I was like, phew, because the fines are really high if you don't do those. So do make sure that you check if you have a portal for your licensing authority. Do make sure that you've checked and done those, or that you've registered with the Ministry of Finance for those areas that you need to register as well, because you don't want to have to be paying an accountant or some other consultancy business to argue your case to get the fine waived because you didn't know that you were supposed to register. Still lots of Arabic invoice questions. Bianca, you're so naughty.
Sorry. I saved the best for last.
So these are just comments. Someone said, we had the labor inspections at the same time of approving the quota, and then they came and checked all of our existing supplier and customer contracts, invoices, etc., but never fussed or asked for Arabic invoices. Yeah,
again,
and a lot of people are saying that their accounting software doesn't even do it in Arabic, and somebody pointed out that one of the softwares that's authorized by the FTA only does invoices in English. So people are querying.
I want to clarify, when the labor comes and reviews you, the labor is not the entity that actually regulates these invoices in Arabic for the purposes of this law. It's the consumer protection departments that will look into whether or not you've issued an Arabic. Now, like I said earlier, it is not really being enforced as of now, but it is provided in the law. And as a lawyer, I have to tell you what's in the law. How you choose to operate and whether or not you issue an invoice and whether or not it's being regulated, we just have to, weigh the pros and cons and see. And I do have to mention also, Jen, there are implementing regulations that are meant to come out for the consumer protection law and the data protection law, and that will set out more clarity perhaps. So we are still awaiting these implementing regulations.
And this is why it's really important as well as a business owner that you really stay on top of these things that are happening and attend regular update sessions with lawyers such as Bianca and the UN Women in NAMA host or other organizations, because as a business owner, saying that you didn't know is not an excuse for getting out of a fine.
Interestingly, Jen, you just quoted an article of the Civil Code, and every civil code in the world, believe it or not, has this one particular clause that says ignorance of law is not an excuse. So believe it or not, if you're flying to Cyprus and you do something illegal that you can't say, I didn't know the laws of Cyprus. You have to know ignorance of law cannot be excused. It's the weirdest thing, but it's true.
I should have been a lawyer, Bianca. Okay, I'm going to throw up the last poll here really quickly. Please, I would be super grateful if everyone could fill it in. We have 101 participants. I would like to see 101 people answering it, please, because it really helps us with UN Women as well to be able to identify what's working, if you like the sessions, and they really like to be able to see that we're making a difference and making an impact, because that's what this program is all about, is that we want to be able to make an impact and to be able to help you and your businesses do really well. So please give us your feedback, because it will be a great help. Bianca, while we maybe answer a few other questions for people who are leaving, if you could skip a couple other slides ahead to the second to last slide that has that picture. Exactly. So next Tuesday, I'm actually running a session. I haven't run a session just by myself for all of you for a while. And next session, we're talking about systems that help you build your business. This is one of my absolute favorite topics to cover, talking about business systems. And we're going to look at a number of different systems, from operational to finance to marketing, all of the people systems, all of these things that will help you if you can get them right in the beginning for your business. As you start to grow and scale, it will help you so much more, and it will help you scale quicker as well. Someone says there's a question in the poll about trademark rights. Oh, yeah, excuse that. I think that ignore the intellectual property and trademark rights. I think that was copied over from a last session. So it's just asking you about your knowledge for legal essentials. So apologies for that. Basically, we just want to know, after you have taken this session, how knowledgeable you found that was. Bianca, everybody is sharing lots of love for you and telling you how wonderful it was and how amazing. We get asked this question all the time, and the answer is always yes. It has been recorded and it will be available after the session. UN Women has a YouTube channel and the videos are put up there. We have a few people saying, thank you, Bianca, you're my favorite lawyer in my speed dial. Great info, and as always, a wake-up call to keep learning about your business. And we also get asked, how can we join the session on the 26th? I believe that you will most likely be getting an email today or tomorrow, as always, from the wonderful UN Women team, asking you to sign up and register so you can come next week as well. So you will be seeing me same time next week, and the rest of the UN Women team. Bianca, thank you for being a superstar. Thank you for sharing so much of your knowledge and your experience with all of our entrepreneurs. It's so important to have access to this knowledge, and it really helps women in business. So thank you for your time today with that.
Thank you very much. And before I leave, if I may stop share, because I do want to give everybody a very important link that I have. Very quickly, just give me 1 second. I'm going to pop it into the chat. This is a very crucial link that I was talking about. I'm going to pop it in the chat relating to consumer protection. This is a UAE government website. So hop on today whenever you can. And it also gives you the links to various consumer protection departments in the various emirates. So you have an idea, if at all a consumer or client brings a claim against you, at least you have an understanding of how they do it, what the process is.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to UN Women as well, and for NAMA Women Advancement for making these sessions available. It's so brilliant that they're investing so much in helping and supporting women entrepreneurs. And thank you to all of you for taking part and being so engaging and learning and asking so many questions. So thank you so much, everybody. Have an absolutely beautiful rest of the day. And I will see you next Tuesday at 10:30. Have a wonderful day. Bye.